Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Michael Patrick Lynch, a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, where you direct the Humanities Institute. You do a lot of writing. You write sometimes for that New York Times feature, The Stone, where philosophers write. And you've written a number of books. Most recently, the book we're going to talk about, The Internet of Us, Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data, which looks exactly like this, for those of you who aren't just listening on audio podcast. For those of you who are, it's a very attractive book. So I think it's safe to say that in this book you express a number of concerns about where the internet is taking humanity, and the concerns range from what I guess a philosopher like you would call epistemology, how we know things, the sense in which we do know them, how that's changing, all the way to things like social conflict. You know, does the internet foment antagonism, tribalism, and so on, and uncivil discourse? And the various issues come up along the way, like privacy and so on. So there's a lot to cover here. You choose to start the book by talking about something in the future, although you see your concerns as manifest right now. The trends are underway that you're concerned about, but you choose to start the book by talking about something called neuromedia, Neuromedia, which may be your own coinage. I'm not sure. Is it?
It is, yeah.
Congratulations. We'll try to give that some propulsion, and hope we can make that. Hope it'll wind up in the Oxford English Dictionary a decade or two from now. But what do you mean by that, and why'd you choose to start the book that way?
Okay, so let me first explain the idea behind it. It's a thought experiment, and basically what I'm asking people to do in the beginning of the book is to imagine having all the capabilities of your smartphone miniaturized to such a degree that they're hooked up directly to your neural net. So as a result, you would be able to access the internet and access all the various apps and capabilities of your smartphone faster than the speed of tweet, even at the speed of thought.
So Google would be kind of built into your brain?
It would be built into your brain, not just Google, of course, but also your the various apps that rely on search engines, but also things like your contact list, that sort of thing. And we can imagine app writers writing software just for neuromedia, so you can use all the various other apps that you can now use on your smartphone. I mean, in one clear sense, as I say right away, this would be really exciting. I mean, I'm the sort of person that likes these gadgets, and so I can imagine I begin in a way. You ask me why I begin this way, because in a certain sense, for me, it's sort of like an existential question. Would this be a good thing? Would I look forward to it? Well, in a certain sense, I think sure we would. It would mean that we wouldn't have to fumble with our phone. It would mean that we would be able to walk into parties and access perhaps images of the people that we had met before, so we would know all sorts of, in a sense, it seems like we would know in a more immediate, intimate way, or have at least access to all the information that we can access on Wikipedia and the like. And we'd be able to, of course, share things this way, just as we can share things on the internet now. One of the great things about the internet and the internet economy is the fact that we can share and upload things. So it's not just downloading, but uploading. And this would make coordination between people a much easier thing for all sorts of things that we like to do, like artistic projects, science, healthcare could be improved in this way, we might think. But of course, also things like war, shared activities require coordination, would be sped up in a sense, our coordination would be sped up if we had this sort of capability. And as my last comment reveals, I think when you think about this sort of thing, you can also imagine that if there was a society that had, neuromedia, you can imagine that there would be a few cranky fusspots, a few old people that might sort of worry about it. For the most part, I think most people would probably be sold on the convenience, at least if it was inexpensive enough.
you've got at least a little cranky fusspot in you, right?
I do. I do. And I think a lot of people do. I think most of us, what I'm trying to describe is what I think most people, right, probably would react.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, you're right, there is the appeal in the abstract.
Sure.
At the same time, it feels a little creepy, and you almost
creepy.
have trouble imagining it. So, like, what would communication with another person be like? Would I just, like, send a thought to them, or,
right.
Or what?
Well, that would be, it seems like that would be the sort of thing that we can imagine doing. I talked to designers about how you would have to go through setting up this sort of device, even in the abstract. And as I cited in the book, there actually is research ongoing that has had some limited success using the internet to allow people to communicate mentally.
People can move like cursors on the screen by thinking and stuff like that, right?
So the weird thing about this thought experiment is, when I first thought about it, when I first started going around the world talking about it, people would sort of look at me funny. This was maybe 5 years ago, which is a long time in the age of technology. Now I mention it and people are like, "Oh yeah, when's that happen?" And now I think there are, as I was about to say, really difficult engineering problems. But even if you put those aside, the really interesting question that it gets us to think about is the fact that information and our access to information, particularly our access to information, is changing rapidly. And it's changing in a certain level, the level of intimacy in which we interact with information, in which we know things via other people, is changing. One of the things that neuromedia would do is we could have this conversation without necessarily opening in a sort of almost telepathic way, without opening our mouths. That would put us in perhaps a more intimate space, but it also opens up all these worries about privacy and, as you said, the sort of creepy aspects of having the world in our head. One way I like to put it is the internet. Well, it's like a big window, right? And we can look out at the world. It gives us the world, but also the world can look back at us. And so that's the intimacy that is emerging with our continuing and building relationship with the internet.
And even leaving aside the fact that the world can look back at us, I mean, you do get into these privacy issues, but as far as the kind of knowledge issues, the epistemology issues, I think one thing you're arguing is that we're already closer to neuromedia than we realize, in the sense that in the pure neuromedia world, the line between what you know, what's in your head that you know, and what's in your head that actually is dependent, has some other source, that line would get very blurry. The line between external sources and internal knowledge. And I think you're saying that that's kind of already happening in some ways that you find a little unsettling.
Yes, I do think it's already happening. Of course, philosophers like Andy Clark and David Chalmers have discussed for a couple decades the possibility of what they call the extended mind, that even before the internet, that the human mind has always been extended to our notebooks, and that the written word extended the mind in certain real sense.
The Rolodex being the example that people of our age grew up with. Yes.
Right, exactly. But even if you put that sort of more radical hypothesis aside, it does seem pretty clear that our ways of coming to know things, our processes by which we come to know things, even if not the knowledge itself, are distributed and are increasingly distributed because of technology. And that does, as you said, break down the barrier between what we used to call external ways of knowing something, let's say engaging with partners in a lab and working together to produce some knowledge, and internal ways of knowing something that is reflecting on it and engaging our critical faculties. If we had neuromedia, that would be sort of graphically illustrated, I think. But as you said, I think we're already heading in that direction. In part, I think that's because we're coming to more and more rely on a certain way of knowing, I call Google knowing in the book, which is, I've come to decide, somewhat of a misleading title, although it's evocative. Google knowing is really knowing by digital interfaces. It's the sort of knowledge that knowing we do when we pick up our smartphone and engage with apps on the phone. So it's not just looking up things on Google.
And can I interrupt you to say that for people who are watching, there's a cartoon in your book that I think is central to this. It's, I guess, a New Yorker cartoon. Woman saying to a man, presumably her husband, do you really know what you're doing, or do you Google search know?
Exactly.
What you're doing.
But, he's trying to fix a sink, and she's looking at it skeptically. Right. And that is, that cartoon is so great because it really puts its finger on this misgiving that a lot of us can have, even those of us like me, and I think almost every other human nowadays that has access to a computer. We do rely on search engines like Google, and we rely on the apps on our cell phone to get us around the world. Nonetheless, that very reliance has become so dominant with regard to how we come to know things that we've come to not even notice how dominant and reliant on it we really are. So one way of illustrating that is, well, a couple different ways. Think about what our go-to source for knowing something is right now. If you're in a dispute over any trivial, even fact, at a dinner party or at a bar or, just with a couple friends, pretty quickly somebody's going to jump on Google and try to settle the matter, which in many ways is really helpful. In other ways, it can be really annoying, of course, depending on the context.
Depending on whether you were right or wrong.
Right, exactly. But what that seems to illustrate is that, we used to say that, right, seeing is believing. Now we tend to think of really, whether we know it or not, that Googling is believing. It's not real unless we verified it by checking the internet. Now, the internet actually is, I think, the greatest fact checker that's ever been invented. It's also, of course, as we also all know, the greatest BS producer that's ever been created. And that's what, of course, makes our intimate relationship to it, our dependence on it, our sort of unthinking dependence on it, so disquieting, even to those of us who, like myself, continue to keep using it, which all of us will do.
Let me ask you, is your main concern that the information may be unreliable? I mean, as you said, there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, and not all of it true. Or even if the reliability were very high, would the change in the nature of knowledge still bother you? In other words, the kind of lack of self-sufficiency of the knowledge, or the lack of completeness of the individual's understanding of any given thing. And of course, this is another trend that's been a while in the making. It predates the internet in a certain sense.
Of course.
People have become more dependent on various kinds of authorities for what they know, but you see my question, I guess. Is it the fact of dependency, or is it the danger that the dependency will be misplaced? Kind of.
Okay, so I think it's both, and I think it's important not to trivialize either. But we've just talked about the danger, and in a sense, the most obvious danger is the issue of depending on the wrong sources on reliability. As I said, I think that's something that every user of the internet is aware of that danger, even if they continue to ignore it, which is the point that I was trying to make. I think the interesting point is not that, wow, there's a lot of false stuff on the internet. No kidding, right? My 10-year-old knows that. The interesting fact is, despite that fact, we continue to rely on it in an incredibly intimate and go-to way. It's default for us. In that way, it's a lot like, to return to my analogy, it's a lot like sense perception. We all know, every human being knows that their senses can deceive them, right? That things can look different to different people. That you can hear things the wrong way. You can see something in the distance that is not, as it actually is as you get closer. But, of course, we still have to rely on our senses, because they are our most intimate way of accessing information. We can't just give up on our senses, and at least putting aside weird things like sensory deprivation chambers and so forth. We have to rely on them. The really first point that I was trying to make is that in a way, Google knowing and knowing by digital interface is becoming more like sense perception. It's becoming built into us and something that we rely on and feel that we cannot give up, even though we realize that it can have this problem with reliability. And that leads to the second point you're quite, you really put your finger on, the second concern of mine. The fact that it's become so a default go-to source of information, analogous to sense perception in certain respects, also means that something else is happening, something that is troubling even if the internet proved to be 100% reliable. And that fact is this loss of autonomy. Again, it's not new to think that humans always have to, as I say in the book, have to depend on other people for information. No human society can flourish without sharing information and sharing knowledge. So again, that's not. What's wild is the fact that we're taking something that is as intimate as sense perception, a way of knowing that's becoming as intimate as sense perception, and that we rely on almost as much as sense perception, and for many things more. And we're combining it. With this radical dependency on other people. The internet is, in a sense, a testimony machine. We are relying on the testimony of other people, and in some cases, machine algorithms for information. You put those two things together, and you get a new way of knowing. It's a way of knowing that is heavily dependent and intimate. Perception is intimate and a go-to source, but it doesn't depend on other people. Mm-hmm. Reading a book is dependent on somebody else, but it's not got that sort of that automatic sense that the internet is increasingly having in our lives. It doesn't require a lot. The internet, accessing the internet, for many of us, requires almost no effort. Mm-hmm. It's becoming increasingly automatic and painless. Mm-hmm. It's not like spending the effort to go get the book, read the book, find the right book, check the sources, that sort of thing.
So you're worried partly about a decline in our critical faculties. I mean, the entire kind of intellectual toolkit it takes to like analyze sources, construct an argument, and so on.
I am worried about that. I don't want to say I'm all doom and gloom about it. My own view is that technology is not going away. What I'm trying to do is to say that we need to be careful of the fact that there are different ways of knowing, other than the sort of knowing that we're increasingly relying on, what I call Google knowing. Mm-hmm. I said I think Google knowing has some distinctive combination of characteristics. But there are other ways of knowing that, yes, I'm worried about. One is the sort of critical reasoning and the game of giving and exchanging reasons in an explicit way that I think sometimes the over-reliance on Google knowing can overshadow. Mm-hmm. And then there's also an even deeper way of knowing, which I call understanding, which I think is even more important or as important as the sort of critical thinking that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of, I think, related phenomenon I've observed in the world of online journalism, on Twitter and also in the world of, kind of blogs and so on, which is just that you look over the last 30 years or so when I first started, writing stuff until now, the contribution of an individual journalist to the understanding of something has become a smaller increment of the understanding, if that makes sense. On the other hand, the understanding materializes more rapidly, or at least the analysis materializes more rapidly. If you watch a world event get processed on Twitter, and the understanding of it emerge, or a particular analysis of it emerge from a particular ideological perspective or whatever, it's typically the case that there's kind of no one owner of that at the end, the way there might have been 30 years ago when, like, you wrote the definitive column really making sense of this phenomenon. One person wrote the column. Now it's like individual people make these little contributions, and then the collection of insights or collection of facts emerges. But each person's role, and it's amazing that it emerges so fast, but each person's role is somewhat shrunken, and I think that's related to what you're talking about, and it leads to this. Well, for the first question is, do you think it's related? But it also there's a related question, which is a lot of this concern about individual brains becoming more and more interwoven into a kind of giant superorganic brain. I mean, that's what this neuromedia thing almost suggests. It's like, imagine yourself becoming a mere nerve cell in a brain. Does that metaphor capture a lot of your concern, at least in this particular realm of kind of epistemology?
Well, yeah, definitely captures some of my concerns. It's one of the things that I talk about in the book is the implications for what's called the networking of knowledge. I think that neuromedia, which in a sense a sort of logical endpoint of where we're going, would clearly threaten certain aspects of our cognitive autonomy. And that trade-off might be okay with a lot of people, and might be okay with me in a lot of ways. I think it would, as I said, right from the get-go, would allow us to share information much more rapidly and hence coordinate much more rapidly. And we can imagine getting to the point where we would sort of finish each other's thoughts in the way that we can on Twitter, but not as quickly as we would be able to do it in neuromedia. And that would have a lot of cognitive and epistemic benefits. It's important to emphasize here, perhaps, that the book's title is Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data. That's its subtitle, rather. And the things that I just said are meant to. There's my iPhone beeping at me right now.
Can't ignore that.
It's disagreeing with me. The point there is that knowing more is something that the internet and the neuromedia would actually, of course, allow us to do. And one reason for that would be because, as you just said, we'd get this sort of hive mind. Now, what are the bad parts of the hive mind? Well, we put aside privacy. The other part is the part that we're talking about now, that what I call autonomy, cognitive autonomy. The ability to sort of not just think for yourself, but to discover things for yourself on your own and add your own creative insights. That's certainly possible in online now, and one of the great things about this sort of the process of, let's say, processing something like the Arab Spring through Twitter is that we do see insights, as you quite rightly put it, emerge that would not have been possible if we had not had so many voices at the table. Nonetheless, it's also important to keep in mind that while this leads to the democratization of knowledge, as I call it in the book, it also can, at the same time, undermine the democratization of knowledge. How so? Well, groups can produce results that individuals couldn't, but they can also be manipulated in ways that individuals can't too. And that is something that we need to manipulate and take advantage of. Because sometimes things can emerge from groups, and the groups can go in a particular direction that's, in some cases, not valid or not true or not ethical. But they can also be led in that direction by people who see that there's some profit in it. Mm-hmm. And we see that, of course, on Facebook. We see that on Twitter. We see that watching events in this presidential election unfold. Mm-hmm. How certain facts about human beings, like the fact that we're prone to bias ourselves towards information that already seems to agree with what we believe, right? We tend to accept that more readily. Makes it easier for us to be pushed around and manipulated by people, and that result is increased when we're working in groups. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of data on that. So I think that gives you reason to not feel like the problems of knowledge are just going to be solved if we were to have neuromedia. Well, some of these traditional problems about cognitive autonomy, mm-hmm. would reappear with a vengeance.
And what do you say to people who in terms of this concern about, being manipulated and so on, people who say, well, wait a second, but now you have more choice than ever about whose influence you fall under, and compare this to the world 40 years ago. I mean, if you're concerned about people being, I think I'll close this door given my dogs, no, they seem to have quieted down. 30, 40 years ago, there were 3 networks.
Right, sure.
And so if you want to talk about passive receptacles of externally imparted knowledge, people would say that was the a more extreme case than this. So where does that analysis go wrong?
What I'd say is I think the issue is different. So in a piece I wrote about in the New York Times, one of the things I talked about was that, I had just recently reread, at the time I wrote the piece, the Chomsky book, Manufacturing Consent, which was very much about the idea that big media at the time, several large newspapers, the 3 networks, were controlling the content by which we were learning about the world, particularly the political world. And one of the things that really strikes you when you reread that book is how much things have changed. The idea that there are 3 networks, right, as you just said, that's sort of quaint now. Now, as you said, there are many, many voices at the table. At Real Donald Trump, for example, is one such voice, and that voice that's a Twitter feed that a lot of people get a lot of information from. And lots of different Twitter feeds act, in a sense, not just as a person's personal voice, but as a sort of a type of media. And of course, anybody that engages in Twitter or Facebook, like I do, you cultivate that, in a sense. You are cultivating these media spaces yourself. That's the point of this sort of, and Instagram is another example of self-curation, where we're presenting information, as the old media used to do, in ways that we think presents the facts as we see them, in some cases the facts about ourselves, right? Now, what does that mean? What it means is that consent is still being manufactured. The worry that we're being manipulated is still there. It's just that it's become more complicated now. We are manufacturing consent ourselves. We are participants in this sort of manufacturing. Of course, it also throws up the fact, into highlight the fact that while in the old days it was conveyors of content, the big conveyors of content that we would worry about as far as manipulating and manufacturing consent. Nowadays, of course, there's also the worry that the people who control the sources of information or the channels of information, like Google and Apple, are things to worry about. Because, of course, nowadays, while Google doesn't produce, well, most of what it does is not produce content. It gets you to content. It directs you to content using, of course, your own preferences and the preferences of other people. And what that means is when you search online for information, what you're searching, the results of your search are the direct result of your prior searches and the searches of other people who search for similar things. That's why it works so well. But of course, that also is why when you search for things like climate change on the internet, one of the things that Google might prompt you that you might be interested in is whether it's a hoax, right? Because, of course, the preferences of other people can put certain sorts of information higher on your feed.
But you wouldn't want people excluded from that kind of, entirely excluded from that perspective, right? I mean, you would want a world in which alternative perspectives, whatever you think of them, are accessible.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I have my own political views and my own scientific views, but I certainly think it's a great thing, as I said earlier, that the internet has been able to, in certain senses, democratize knowledge. What I'm in the uncomfortable position of doing is something that a lot of philosophers have to do in general. It's sort of like, since this is the role of, I find, at least in my philosophical life, of sort of also trying to remind people that, well, that's great, but you might want to think about the consequences.
And how much
and that's what I'm saying here, is that, I think we're too prone sometimes, Bob, to feel that, knowledge has become so much easier. That's such a good thing. We're so much more democratic in our internet life. I just don't think that's necessarily true. And I think things are as complicated as they ever have been.
And how much of the problem is, this is something that's been much discussed, and you talk about it in the book, how much of the problem is that, notwithstanding the fact that all possible perspectives are in principle accessible to me,
right,
at the same time, it is more possible than ever for me to wall myself off from them in an almost unthinking way, sometimes abetted by these various search tools and these social media, to actually become oblivious to evidence contrary to what I believe, or to put myself in a community that deems all such evidence readily dismissible. And of course, this is one difference with the three TV network world, is that, for better or worse, there was no way to wall yourself off from the perspectives being disseminated by the three networks, right? I mean, the mainstream, the kind of establishment consensus, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, I guess, depending on the consensus. There was no way of avoiding it, and it was hard to entirely dismiss it. And that seems like a this is, again, it's been much discussed, but you do pay some attention to it in the book, and I'm wondering how big a part of the problem you think it is.
Yeah, so the problem of echo chambers has been much discussed. I sometimes think of it as information bubbles. I also use the metaphor, as I said before, of the fact that we curate our own online lives. Our online lives are curated like a museum, in a way, for public consumption. And what does that imply? Well, I think on the one hand, it shows the sort of paradox that we're in, which is that we have more information, as you said, but we, in a sense, access only small amounts of it. Part of that is because as information has exploded to such a degree, we've invented ways to deal and process with that fact. Mm-hmm. It's just not possible to sort of process all the information that's available right now on any topic. You need aids. You need guides. That's what Google has been that's what's so genius about it. It is that it uses the hive mind in a way to help steer you in one direction or another, and your past preferences, the preferences of the hive mind. What I think is not often noticed is that this fact of the echo chamber, of the plethora of information that we think we have access to, actually encourages us to be epistemically overconfident. By that I mean overconfident about what we think we know. Mm-hmm. We tend to think we know more in a richer sense of know than Google know. We think we understand more than we actually do about the world. And that tends to set up not just further polarization, but a lack of mutual understanding between people, let's say, over politics or over science. I think it's that's the point that I think is truly troubling. Echo chambers are one thing. It's that echo chambers have a way of increasing the rigidification of their own walls, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people right now in this country are rightly worried about.
Mm-hmm. Have you found anything that works in terms of combating this problem? You've been thinking about it for some time, I guess. I mean, are there any known cures for the kind of tribalism, broadly speaking, that is abetted by the echo chamber effect and the kind of epistemic overconfidence?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different one way of trying. Of course, the first step in solving any problem is to recognize that you have it. Mm-hmm. And that's also to recognize, and in this case, that means recognizing that all of us are part of it. When I talk about curating our own lives, I like that metaphor because it sort of puts the responsibility back on us. This is not, sometimes we talk about echo chambers, and it tends to be the sort of thing like, those people over there, gee, I wish they could just access the right information, and then they would be enlightened.
Yeah, namely my opinion.
Namely my opinion, exactly. That's not the right attitude. The right attitude is actually to start with your own epistemic life, online and off. And that could involve trivial things like making yourself access and interact with media sources, even if they're Twitter feeds, of people that you have different views than your own. But it can also involve thinking about how to cultivate empathy for the other side. And I think there's been a lot of interesting psychological work done in the last 10 years on the role that empathy plays in meaningful public discussion and in knowledge formation, and I think about other people, that is. And I think that one thing to start thinking about is, and one way to cultivate empathy is to actually put down your tablet and your phone and to actually get involved in your local community. And of course, a lot of people do this. I mean, that's a great thing. You know, you work at your local soup kitchen, or you volunteer for a political campaign, and those sorts of things. And that puts you in touch with people, let's say, that are not necessarily always agreeing with yourself, if you're going door to door, for example. And those things can cultivate at least empathy, or, of course, as a lot of other psychologists will tell you, they can also harden your own views. I mean, one of the things that's really you need to be careful about is realizing that limited, small, short exposure to people who have other views can harden your views rather than actually raise empathy. So what I'm talking about is the sort of thing of changing one's habits, changing one's listening habits. I know that I make this sound like a very personal sort of thing, but I don't think that at the systemic level, anything other than just increased importance on education and critical thinking really is going to matter. That will help. Funding for education, funding for critical programs of critical thinking at young ages, those sorts of things have been shown to help. But people are more receptive to each other if they've been exposed to different viewpoints early on in their lives. That's all right, but that's the sort of large-scale intervention that the ordinary person, the ordinary listener, is not going to be able to do. Anyway, that's there's no easy answer, I think.
No, it is a subtle problem. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, the what's troubling is the amount of evidence that, under a lot of circumstances, exposure to alternative opinions, or even exposure to information that in principle should change your own opinion, actually has the effect of hardening your pre-existing
This
opinions.
is why the role of empathy is really important. It sort of depends on where you are emotionally in a conversation, whether you're going to see that other person as, even though they're saying things you don't agree with, you want to treat them with equal respect.
So they need to have been kind of defined in your mind as not the enemy,
Exactly,
for you to be receptive to the information.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think all of us know in our Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds is that it very quickly devolves into the enemy is saying blank. How can the enemy say blank? How can any right-thinking person say blank? I mean, a deeper sort of issue here, going back to sort of more systemic things, to put more flesh on the bone about what I meant by critical thinking. One of the big problems that the internet has sort of made worse, it's always been a problem, is the fact that in culture we don't sometimes just disagree over values. We don't just disagree over facts. We also disagree over methods for figuring out what the facts are. And this is particularly true right now in the U.S., that when we think about big debates like climate change and evolution, those debates are really not just about the facts. They're about whether, let's say, the scientific method is appropriate to use to solve certain questions, or whether it can be trumped by other methods. Right? That is, methods that involve, let's say, appeal to religious scriptures.
So what are the legitimate sources of intellectual authority?
Sort of right, exactly. What are the legitimate sources of inquiry? The methods that we should use for engaging and finding out what the facts are.
And there may be a distinction here between issues of value. I mean, in terms of the kinds of things you specify as legitimate sources of authority, there's clearly going to be a distinction between issues of value. You know, who should you turn to for guidance on what's right and wrong, as opposed to issues of fact, like, is the world heating up?
Exactly, right. So in both cases, whether we're talking about facts or values and the authorities, and we're going to be also possibly, and we are, I think, what I'm trying to say, right now in our culture, often disagreeing fundamentally about the sources of authority, as you put it. And when things get that deep, it's often difficult to know how to recover, how to climb back out of the cave and see the light of reason, so to speak. Because if you disagree with my sources of authority, and I try to back them, I try to defend them, I'm probably going to appeal to my sources of authority. What else? What other methods am I going to appeal to? I'm not going to appeal to yours. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that right now in our culture, we better work hard to find some epistemic common ground. That is, principles that most of us, at least, could come to agree on as codifying good ways of figuring out what the facts are. And not everybody's going to agree. But we're going to have to agree that at least for cases of public discussion, there are certain methods, let's say methods of appealing to experience and certain types of science that at least for public discussion seem appropriate, right? That is when we're trading reasons in the public sphere, public square. You need to back it up with some sort of appeal to logic and evidence. Now, I think that if we don't come up with some principles, maybe not those, but if we don't come up with some principles that are common, then I think we're really all hope is lost. But I think it is possible through education and through thinking about which principles are most democratic to appeal to actually get to a lot of people to agree that, let's say, appealing to evidence and logic is a good way to go in public discussion. The real hard question is, what is evidence and what is logic?
Okay.
Sorry, that was a long philosophical.
No, it was very to the point. And you are a philosopher, so you're allowed to go on for longer than 12 seconds.
Yeah.
So, speaking of your being a philosopher, I don't know exactly how long you've been teaching college students, but I would guess that it goes back to a time before the internet had so transformed the landscape of knowledge seeking and opinion expression and opinion formation and so on. I'm wondering, have you noticed changes in this in cohorts of students? Do they seem in some significant ways different to you than they seemed 20 years ago?
Yes and no. I tend to find my students, I love teaching, and I still think that people are come in different all shapes and forms, and a lot of those people are really still, just as much as they were earlier, really interested in knowledge and fundamental questions and excited and curious people. And that's great. I think what it has changed, clearly, is how we learn has changed. And in some ways, those methods of learning are for the better, and for some other ways it's sort of problematic. This has been much written about by other people, but one way of illustrating it in terms of our conversation is just to think about, look, if neuromedia was around, what would be the point of higher education, in some sense? Now, there would be a point, but that question is already sort of with us right now. I mean, the internet is already here. So why are people paying so much money for people like me to get up and talk to them?
You mean if they could just stay at home, not go to college, but have the world of knowledge at their fingertips?
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, the answer to that is not too hard. One harks back to what we were talking about before. We still need ways of sorting through the information online. And we still haven't invented a way yet that is, even despite Google's amazingness, that is superior to appeal to analog experts who have spent their life sorting through, let's say, a particular type of scientific question. But the other answer is probably, equally important, which is that we need higher education teaches us those, not just what the answers are, but how to ask questions, how to learn more, and how to put things together, how to put the big picture together and connect the dots. That's what I call in the book understanding. And that's a creative act. And that's something that really, in a way, can't be directly taught, but can be coached. And that's what I sort of see my role. Now, the differences, to answer your question, I think some of the differences are hark back to this again, the sort of neuromedia thing. It really sort of puts a fine point on teaching people the critical thinking and the understanding parts. Because right now, while I'm talking in a lecture, people can get online and see not just what I've already written about it, but what people who disagree with me have written about it, right? And can jump ahead pretty quickly. And that's great. But that sort of does, raise this question of, well, what am I doing out there? What I hope I'm doing is engaging them as autonomous individuals, as thinkers, getting them to engage in that sort of creative aspect of knowledge formation.
Okay. In closing, I want to talk just briefly about privacy, an issue you bring up, and you start your discussion of it with a kind of a fascinating historical anecdote, a law review article by Louis Brandeis and a co-author from, more than 100 years ago.
Right.
That was about, and maybe this was in the title, the right to privacy, or it was maybe, I guess, arguing for a right to privacy. But what's fascinating is what the issue was that had occasioned their concern, the technological development that had occasioned their concern about the erosion of our privacy. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so this is possibly the most cited law review article ever in the United States law. And it is entitled The Right to Privacy. And what occasioned this discussion was the invention of the camera, the Kodak camera in particular, a accessible camera that could be cheaply bought and used, and was quickly used and adopted by the media and what we would call now the paparazzi, to take photos, often unflattering photos, of famous people. Mm-hmm. And that's what occasioned...
That seemed outrageous to them, that a celebrity could have their picture taken in public, and people could see it.
Exactly.
Now, does that... I assume that you don't find that outrageous, because you, like me, grew up with it being just a fact about life. Does the fact that they found it outrageous make you wonder, whether your concerns about privacy and my concerns and concerns that are widely expressed may someday seem quaint and even be in some sense be rightly seen as quaint, right? Is there...
No.
Okay.
So the reason for that is if you think about what's quaint is worrying about cameras in a way. Although I would emphasize that if you and I were celebrities, people who were household names, we wouldn't find it so quaint. We find it to be a real concern. It is paparazzi today are a real concern. People climbing over fences to take pictures of you, right, in your own backyard. Right, not only might be violating some laws, but are actually, it creeps people out, and I can understand that. Now you could say, well, that's the price of fame. Being a prisoner of your own fame is just too bad. That's a bummer. But that depends on who you are and what the case is. Now, I don't think that issue has gone away. What's happened is that we've just become more. What we have done is we've adopted photos and use them for other things other than paparazzi purposes, right? We now realize that we can take family photos and show them and use photos that become a sort of art. All of which was actually already true then, when they wrote the article in the 1890s. What the authors of Brandeis and Warren were really trying to get at was that privacy invasions tend to undermine our autonomy in a certain way. And this is particularly true, I think, with information privacy. And this has always been true. In the old analog days, if I broke into your house and read your diary, mm-hmm. right? Well, even if I didn't do anything with that information, obviously I could use it to blackmail you, maybe, right? But even if I didn't, even if I just read it and said, and walked away, there's still a sense in which I've undermined a certain decision. I've made it moot. That is, I've made it moot, the question moot of whether to share that information with me. I've decided it for you. I've made that decision for you. Mm-hmm. So I've stripped some of your autonomy away. And that's why, even if I didn't do anything with that information, you would find it creepy if I did that. Mm-hmm. Why people find invasions like that weird. Like, yeah, even if the person says, no, I didn't do anything with I read your emails, but I didn't do anything with them. Well, still, you have no right to do that. That's the point that they were trying to make. And, what I think is we need to remember when we talk about privacy nowadays is that when we give up our privacy, we're giving up a little bit of our autonomy. And in a lot of cases, that's totally justifiable and warrantable and something we're comfortable with. In other cases, we're so intent on what we're getting by giving up our privacy that we might not realize that we're giving up autonomy. And that's what I'm trying to flag. I think there's particularly, the thing I'm worried about is privacy in relation to governmental programs like the NSA spying program, as I would put it. But there's also issues here with how we share information online with each other.
Right. But
this is a long question. It's a big topic.
It's a big issue, right. So there's the government actual surveillance that could be happening without you knowing it, and then there's also just kind of the things that if you do enough research, you'll know that Google's keeping track of this, and they're looking for these keywords in Gmail and serving you these ads in response,
sure,
and so on.
Exactly.
Final question on this, though. Are you finding that your students consider privacy concerns quaint, or consider some of them quaint and some of them not so quaint?
The latter, I think.
Okay.
My own view, what I found talking to people around the country, people have very different views about these things. But it's amazing to me, not just about privacy, but all the stuff that we've been talking about. I actually find that when I give big lectures, public lectures, the people who come up and talk to me the most are not people my age, but younger people. And that's because the people right now who are in college, for example, my students, are not actually digital natives. People who sometimes call current college students digital natives, that's a mistake. My daughter, who's 10, is a digital native. She has never been in a world that did not have smartphones. Okay? But the people who are in college now actually have younger brothers and sisters, and they will tell me, they see a difference between their younger brothers and sisters and them. And that's because they have, although the internet has always been around, right? Over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly the last decade, there's been this explosion of the intimate relationship to the internet has totally changed. So I find that as far as specifically, Bob, about privacy, opinions are mixed, of course. A lot of people don't really understand the things that you were talking about. It's amazing to me that a lot of people still don't understand that when they search online, all sorts of information, and Facebook's entire business, and I use Facebook, but its entire business model, and they're not shy about this. This is what they'll tell you. They're proud of it. Is in information. What they're doing is collecting information. That's that's how they make money. And it is amazing that a lot of people don't know that. But the people who do know it tend to be younger people. I think in some ways are more concerned because they're living a life that's closer to neuromedia than we are.
Mm-hmm. And I would think particularly about the government issue. I mean, as I read, what young people say, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think that's particularly the case. I mean, I think that's true for me too. I mean, I am more worried about government surveillance than I am about Facebook surveillance. But of course, the two things are not unconnected, and
right.
That's again,
we don't know what Facebook is giving the government access to.
Yeah, or right, wittingly or unwittingly, and and again, there's the two sides of that story too. Government surveillance has a point, and security is an important issue too. These are very complicated political and ethical questions.
Well, listen, thank you, Michael. We could have talked a lot longer because there's a lot of important issues that you address in this book. Acutely, the Internet of Us, knowing more and understanding less in the age of big data. So good luck with it. I hope it turns you into the kind of celebrity who has to worry about privacy. That's my wish for you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me.
Okay. Take care.